places where we can contribute to a healthier society. We all have the potential to cultivate an awareness of what is happening around us, and we may be able to help those who are feeling powerless to find their strength. Okay. Marcia will be joined in the presentation by Emil Morris. Emil Morris works for the Women's Resource Center of the New River Valley, a nonprofit agency founded in 1977, devoted to serving the needs of survivors of partners and sexual violence, their families, and friends. In addition to shelter, advocacy, and crisis intervention work, the WRC-NRV brings education and outreach to groups and schools across the New River Valley. Marcia and Emil would be glad to entertain your questions at the conclusion of the program. Thank you so much.
Jim, if I can interrupt for a second, I've got a request to put up captions, but I don't know how to do that. I've never been asked for that before. Does anybody know how to put up captions?
So I believe you should have some options in like you know, where there's like mute, stop video, those things. There should be an annotations there, I think, but I'm not entirely positive. I know
Under participants?
Maybe it should be on that bar, I believe.
It's usually on the bar at the bottom, and it's transcriptions.
There's nothing that says transcriptions.
Then you might not be set up for it.
Yeah, I've got security, participants, chat, share screen, pause and stop recording and reactions. Well, let's continue. I'll continue to poke around and see if I can find something. But I did receive the message, and I'll see what I can do. Sorry, Jim, did you want to continue?
I'd like for Marcia and Emil to go ahead with the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. I work with a little boy, and he's been really good at sharing his cold with me this week. So I'm working through a cold as I'm doing this, but I think we can handle it. First off, I want to say that this is just one story, and it's not everybody's story. There will be similarities between the different stories, but this is just mine. And in this story, I share some things about family that were difficult for me. But I want to say that my family is not perfect, but I love them. I love them. And I think that all of us could say the same thing, that our families were not perfect. So I'm going to start off by talking about abusers are not necessarily all bad. My husband he had lots of positive qualities. I remember early on when I met him, he talked about getting this new hunting rifle when he was a child, and how he was so anxious to try it out that he thought he'd just go out and he'd just shoot at a small bird, knowing full well that he wouldn't hit it. But he did hit it, and it devastated him, and he never wanted to touch the hunting rifle again because he didn't mean to hurt anything. Also, early on, we had both moved to this place that we were going to be working, this school that we were going to be working at. And it happened to be at least a 7-hour drive between there and where his kids lived. And I remember one time he shared with me how much he missed his kids. And it wasn't just him talking about it, but he was crying. He was very distraught about being so far from them. To me, that struck a sensitivity nerve, which was reassuring. Barry was also a conscientious objector. He didn't fight in the Vietnam War, but he went and he worked in a hospital instead. And he and I both protested the war in Iraq in DC because neither one of us liked war, and we think there has to be a better way. I remember after we got married that Barry insisted that we go to our families at Christmas time. And he said that he never wanted our parents to be alone at Christmas. He wanted the family to be close with them. And I thought that was pretty special, even though sometimes I really didn't feel like traveling. We shared a love of nature. We took nature hikes. We enjoyed just being out there and meditating, having quiet time. And if you ever went and you looked at the bulletin board, there would be numerous things that Barry had posted. There were quotes by Mother Teresa, Rumi, and other spiritual leaders. And he was constantly challenging himself spiritually, reading more spiritual texts, hoping that he could become a better person. And the last thing I want to say is that he was voted most valuable teacher one year at the high school where he taught. But then he turned around and he actually rejected the award. And he did that because the award was given by Walmart. And he and I both felt like Walmart was shutting down small businesses, and they weren't really paying their employees well enough. So he had a conscience, and he followed that conscience where it took him. Now, I'm going to go on to what happened to expose a different picture to me. First off, lack of trust. I remember on our honeymoon, I actually got a sign of something that was very disturbing to me. We were driving through the mountains in North Carolina, and we got stopped by road construction. And when the guy turned the sign around to the slow side and Barry started moving around him, I waved and I smiled. And Barry said, "What was that about?" Whoa, I had grown up always being friendly with people, always waving to people I didn't know. It didn't matter. I smiled. And I said, "Well, I'm never going to see this guy again. I'm just making his day maybe a little brighter." Then there was an incident at the lumberyard where we were in there getting some supplies. And when we came back out, Barry was real silent. And I pushed him on it. And I said, "Now what's going on?" And he said, "Oh, I saw you looking at that guy in there." And I had no idea who he was talking about. I was not trying to flirt with anybody. There was nothing going on that I knew of. Another lack of trust sign was that he challenged me about keeping things from him. He would listen into my conversations with family and friends and say, "You never told me that," as if he had to learn everything first. And the real biggie for me was at the end when we were moving from West Virginia to New Hampshire, and he said that he believed that my best girlfriend, who was happily married, was a lesbian. As if I'm not even allowed to have girlfriends. Another thing that exposed a different picture was his need to be in control of what I could and couldn't do. He didn't like my disagreeing with him, and he would argue until I gave in, until I just went along with whatever he wanted. And he was unwilling to agree to replace my car when it broke down. This is a place where I want to read something. I have done some writing about what's happened with him and I, and this is about the car. Almost every time I tried to make a decision for myself, Barry met it with resentment. I tried to persuade him that I needed a car to no avail. I was isolated on the mountain with no transportation. I argued that I could apply for jobs if I had transportation and hence have an income to help out. He wouldn't listen. When I bought a new car with Dad's help, Barry's response came in his deciding to spend an extravagant amount of money to purchase Christmas presents for his kids. We had always worked diligently to make every penny count. While we purchased presents for his kids in the past, modest spending had been the rule. This choice of his struck me like a slap in the face. When I confronted him on it, Barry lashed back. If you were so concerned about money, why did you buy a new car? So he didn't like being left out of decisions, and even simple decisions. Like one time he was at the lumberyard and Dad and I decided to go and get a pizza for supper. And he was very angry when he came back. It was strange, really strange. When he did apologize to me, it felt empty. And I wrote a poem about how his apologies affected me. The poem is called "I Don't Want Your Flowers Anymore." At first, I thought flowers an extravagant and beautiful gesture, but these didn't provide for a genuine healing of spirits. The frequent floral apologies steamed the air between us. I don't want your flowers anymore. It seemed giving me flowers gave you license to dominate me again. I dissolved into nothingness when you dominated, but no, I was not nothing. I don't want your flowers anymore. Why did you get angry when I needed you to listen to me? You didn't need to agree with me, but neither did I need to agree with you. I don't want your flowers anymore. Your flowers have thorns, cause pain. You wanted forgiveness, fine, but I wanted real change. I don't want your flowers anymore. Forgiveness can't be bought. Flowers don't bring healing. Listen to me, respect me. This is the fragrance I desire. And I'm going to turn it over to Emil now for the next part.
It's hard to follow up something that good. Absolutely. I think that everything Marcia, as you know, as we said at the beginning, this is one story, right? And every story is unique. In every violent relationship, in every dysfunctional relationship, in every episode of violence, there are commonalities. And typically at the Women's Resource Center, we describe those commonalities as being part of a system of coercive control or power and control, as we have here. So oftentimes when we think about violence, especially partner violence or domestic violence, we think about it from this very narrow lens, and rarely do we think about it coming from people who we perceive to be very charming and suave and sensitive. Just as you said, often they're people with consciences. They can appear to be good people. We have to remember that people who choose to perpetrate violence were raised in the same society that the rest of us were. They're perfectly capable of invoking the values that they know that we share. And even though many of us, if not all of us, have probably had at some point in our lives the stranger danger conversation, it leaves out some very important parts about the statistical fact that most of the time when violence happens, it is somebody who knows us in some capacity. So the first thing I'll ask is, how violent at this point does it sound like this partner is? And you can give your input in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or you can unmute, but I'm curious as to your perceptions thus far. And I got feedback that my mic is still a little bit quiet. Is this any better? Okay. Yes, no, I see. I'm curious as to how dangerous this person seems thus far. How dangerous do you perceive him to be? You can give feedback in the chat or by unmuting yourself, but at this point, does this person seem dangerous to you? If this was somebody you knew. So about a 3 out of perhaps 5? A 3 out of 10? 3 out of 10. So somewhat, maybe some concerning behavior you describe, right? Anybody else?
I think some of them already know part of my story, so they don't feel like they should be interacting on this.
Right. No, they're like, well, we know how it goes. Right. Absolutely. Hindsight, absolutely. Hard to tell. A lot of undercurrents. Absolutely. Irritating behavior, but not necessarily would make you feel threatened. Yeah, that's how most of these relationships begin. And we'll talk more about what we call the cycle of violence later. Jim says right in the middle, yes, absolutely. So power and control, oftentimes when we see folks that are in violent relationships, there's a social pressure and a response that says, well, why don't you just leave? Power and control is a big part of the reason why, as we'll see in this. A cat with ears flattened, exactly. So tense, uncomfortable, but you're not ready to go, right? Absolutely. So power and control can be asserted in so many different ways, and often it starts with exactly what we're describing here. The subtle criticism, the isolation, the assertion that somebody doesn't get to have friends or get to associate themselves with other people. That's very, very common. And even though every story is unique, there are often, again, these commonalities we can draw, and that's something that's very common for our clients that we see at the Women's Resource Center. So we have another brief exercise that I would like to do to sort of demonstrate the way that people who know us can turn who we are against us. The example I have here is that if I'm in a relationship with somebody who's choosing to perpetrate violence, right, an abuser, somebody who is wanting to isolate and establish power and control over me, and if they know loyalty is really important to me, maybe that's one of the values that I was raised with, one of my sort of core core traits something I want to exemplify. They might say something if I say, I've had enough of your behavior, I'm going to leave. They may say something like insinuating that I'm cheating, right? Or if you're really loyal, you'd give me another chance. If forgiveness is so important to you, why don't you exercise? And it puts people in this very hard position where either your values are called into question or you have to compromise on often these gut feelings of discomfort or danger. So I would like two people to propose values. What are values that are important to you? Honesty. Absolutely. Yeah, I have that. I have that one come up a lot in these talks. Kindness. Yes, those two are great. So often there is a forgiveness trap, right? Kind of like I touched on before. So with honesty, often we will see partners say something like, well, what's the problem with you giving me access to your email or your phone or however you might be reaching out to other people? What's the problem? Why would you be worried about having me there whenever you're associating with other people, you're spending time with your friends? Why would you not want me to be there all the time, right? Absolutely. Somebody, again, frankness, telling you before something is discovered. Absolutely. We have mutual respect, and kindness, again, none of these things that you are saying in the chat, none of these are bad things to value, right? Loyalty, honesty, kindness, forthrightness, these are all good things that we want to exemplify in our daily lives. But with something like kindness, what we often see is somebody who's finally said, I'm going to take this enormous plunge and separate from somebody who's been abusing me. And they come to the shelter and then they get the call, right? And the call is from the partner saying, you're so right. I'm so sorry. I'm going to stop drinking. I'm going to go back to church. I'm going to start talking to our families. Like, I'm going to change all these different behaviors, but I want you to be there with me. I rely on you. You mean the world to me. You're the one for me. And it really pulls on folks. And we have to understand when we're looking at relationships that people are not ready to sever from, or where people are struggling to leave, how complex this is and how hard that can be. So thank you for taking part in that exercise with me. I will pass this back and go on
Okay.
to our next slide.
Okay. So what does it actually mean to be a victim of domestic violence? I felt powerless and like I had little control of my own life. And I felt threatened or scared of my partner at times, of my husband. I often felt that my ideas or opinions weren't valued. In some cases, there's actually physical violence and threats of violence or destroying objects. And it's especially dangerous when you do try to separate or leave. And when I left the second time, Barry did destroy an instrument that my brother had made for me by hand. That was the only time he did that, but he did destroy something my brother had made for me that was very important to me. Oops. You know, and there were things that he would do, like, you know, that were accusing me of not caring, which was something Emil was just talking about. I didn't kiss him at the right time, or I didn't recite my marriage vows to him when he recited them to me, or I didn't say I love you when he wanted me to. Well, to me, all those things would have more meaning if I did them when I initiated them, not when he did. And he was unreasonably jealous. How do people end up becoming abusive persons? My counselor helped me to understand this. For Barry, it was an early attachment issue. And I'm going to tell a couple stories here. One I'm going to do off the cuff, and then one I've got written up. And I don't know if you've ever been around small kittens in your lifetime, but if you're going to tame them, you have to tame them when they're very small. If you wait till they get older, you don't have nearly as good a chance of building the trust with them to the point that they will ever let you really hold them and pet them. Now, the way this relates is that, well, let me read what I wrote down. And this part is called Love is Never Enough. For some, love is never enough. It's not because the love is insincere. For Barry, there was a black hole within him that gobbled up every ounce of love and then looked for more. You see, this black hole is created early on in a person's life. When a person is a very young child, they need reassurance that they are loved consistently. The unfortunate thing is that if people miss out on receiving enough love as an infant, they will not trust the love that comes their way. Most of them never are healthy adults with healthy relationships. They have to go through some tough counseling and deal with the lack of love issue. This is too painful for most adults to face. They have suppressed the pain that haunts them. They do not want to face it now. My husband would not go there. Now, what set me up for this situation? Because I think part of what was happening had something to do with me and my development also. When I was young, I feel like there was not appropriate intervention when kids acted inappropriately. I remember I was the youngest of 4 kids, and I would get teased, and I felt like the other siblings treated me as if my feelings didn't matter sometimes. But my mother, who was our disciplinarian, never really intervened in that and never tried to teach us more appropriate ways to relate to each other. I even remember an extreme one time when I was being tortured by a cousin who had gotten really strong, and he was enjoying his strength by twisting my arm up behind my back, and it was really hurting. My mother didn't stop it. It was like she couldn't hear the pain I was in. My mom, wait a second, hold on a second, I'm trying to figure out. Oh yeah, here's where I go to a story or a couple stories about my mom that help you to understand her. The first example is of my needing to be heard in an early childhood time. And it seems like a small incident, but the reason it is so impressed upon me is that I remembered it. It may have been small, but it was significant for me. I sat and watched in horror as my cousin Beth in her high chair swung her brand new coloring book through the air and bent the pages with her rough play. I would never treat my identical coloring book like that. I believe I got down from the table for a minute, and when I turned back around, she had grabbed mine. I screamed to get my Aunt Leah and my mom's attention. They both seemed perturbed that I had interrupted their conversation, but quickly gave me Beth's coloring book that she had treated so roughly, not wanting to face the wrath of a baby crying if they tried to retrieve mine. The comment was made, "Marcia, they're identical coloring books." There was no concern for or interest in my feelings about the matter. I tried to argue, but to no avail. The fact that I remember this vividly is evidence of how profoundly it affected me. The second example is one that happened much later in my life. And this was in my high school years, and Mom and I were fairly close. Mom and I were very close through much of my high school years. The basic routine we followed was that when she came home from teaching school, we would chat while she made supper and watched the news. The chat encompassed all of her struggles at school with the administration and the other parents. I listened through all of her trials without realizing it, at the time became like a counselor for her. One day I chose to stray from our routine a bit, and I shared some issue that was troubling me. My mom's response was, "You'll figure it out." Then she was on to the next thought. It was then that I realized that this ritual was a one-way street. I was giving and giving of myself while my mom was getting her needs met. She was not offering me anything but the chance to listen to her struggles. I needed her to listen to me also, but she had no emotional energy for me. It became so ingrained in me that I wasn't important enough to listen to. And after this experience, I played around with suicide for a while. Mom loved me, but I needed more. I needed her listening ear, her dedicated focus. And I did get some counseling help at that point, and they did help me to deal with the pain. It wasn't the best counselor situation, and I did have some issues that resulted from that, but it did help me to get past the suicide. Now, for me, the powerlessness became accepted. You know, I didn't feel like my voice mattered. And I felt unlovable. The whole thing was just this cycle. And it's time for you, Emil.
Have to find my unmute. But yes, so just as we kind of mentioned, and just as you were talking about, you know, that phone call, the person pleading for you to come back, and for the most part, people do. It takes a long time for people to finally get out of the entanglement, get out of the clause, so to speak, that these relationships assert, mostly on purpose. Again, you know, there is no one predicting event or behavior or circumstance except for the choice that somebody's making to continue exerting this power and control to harm another person, right? That creates an abuser. You know, it's very similar in some ways to what we occasionally see, and in fact the way that society treats survivors of cults. We are we like to believe, you know, that would never be us. You know, it's very easy to think, well, I would simply leave. It's never that simple. The cycle of violence describes the process that Marcia is describing in this relationship. There are the flowers, right? There are the apologies, there are the promises, and in the very beginning of the relationship, this person is showing you the absolute best parts of them, telling you, again, in our society, we want to find soulmates, you know, we want to find the one. And they're telling us what often we want to hear, what we need to hear. They're addressing these wounds that we may not even be realizing that we're having. But slowly that becomes dysfunctional, right? The criticism, you know, the jealousy, the isolation is such a commonality that we see in cases that's so dangerous, and is such a frequent predictor of violence. The cycle of violence itself happens frequently through a relationship, and it circles faster as the relationship goes on for a longer period of time. And the violence that is taking place tends to become more physical, more harmful, um, just more forceful in most dimensions, right? And often we will hear folks, even folks that, you know, call our hotline, and almost uniformly they'll say something like, I don't want to take space away from somebody who really needs it, right? That's almost always what they say. No matter how bad the violence is, everyone has the sense that they don't deserve help, and everyone does, right? No matter how severe, quote unquote, right, this violence is, because emotional violence leaves very much lasting scars. Psychological violence and manipulation leave lasting, lifelong scars. You know, we think about physical violence most quickly, but this is a system. It's very important, if you're observing friends or family members that you're concerned about, to realize that oftentimes we're picking up on only phase 3. We're not seeing their attempts to make amends in phase 2. We're not seeing the abusers' attempts to make amends in phase 1, right? This grooming process can be so subtle. It makes it very difficult to reach out to somebody who's not ready to have help. And even if they're ready to have help, they've more than likely been conditioned to believe that they don't deserve it. So we really want to, and we'll speak more about this later, be very empathetic as to that individual person's needs, as to what that individual person wants to do. We don't want to say, well, here are all those solutions to your problems. Here's the checklist you can go down. It's never that simple, right? It's always more complex, and it's a real exercise in empathy. And I'll hand it back to you.
Okay. Things that may get in the way of leaving and divorce. Kids. I know people that stay because they are threatened that they will never see their kids again. Just heart-wrenching. For me, I knew I needed to leave for me to ever be truly happy. And I believed that it would be in the best interest of my child. I didn't want him to think Barry's and my relationship was an acceptable relationship, because it wasn't. But one of the things that kept me there for a long time was this idea that marriage is forever. And I stayed with Barry for over 15 years because marriage is supposed to be forever. Now, another thing that got in the way is codependency. I was getting something out of the relationship. I was getting some affection. I was getting the desire by a peer. And so what I was lacking was the ability to love myself. And I had to learn how to love myself in order to, or at least I had to start that process in order to leave. Another thing that got in the way was there's a stigma that goes along with being single in our society a lot of times. And it can be scary to be alone. Now, Barry and I did try joint counseling. The first couple of times that we tried joint counseling, he had been going to a counselor, and then I was introduced into it. And the counselor assured me that Barry was fine, that we could work this out. It was no big deal. Well, the last time I left Barry, he pleaded with me one more time. Let's do counseling. This time I got a counselor that neither one of us had seen. So it was totally a neutral counseling situation. And this is what happened. The counselor brought up something that I needed to deal with. It was tough, but I remember loving him enough to slog through it. Then she looked at him and asked him to look at something that was clearly his to address. He immediately got angry, stood up and yelled, "What is Marcia's part in this?" He refused to open the deep wound that plagued him. He ultimately left the room yelling at us and slamming the door. I knew then that the battle to find a way to save our marriage was over. One person can't make a marriage healthy. I could give up myself to keep him happy, but I didn't want to follow that path anymore. He wasn't willing to meet me with dedication in the struggle to deal with our issues. One thing, it's kind of an aside, but it's something that's important, is I want to talk a little bit about suicide. Because when I left Barry, there were a couple times he mentioned to me suicidal feelings. I took it as his way to try to heart wrench me back into the relationship. Oh, I can't let him fall off this cliff. I have to save him. But I was like, I'm not going there. I can't do that. And I didn't really think he was serious. But I will say in retrospect that I would encourage you to always take suicidal threats seriously. Years later, when his family found out that he had threatened suicide at one point in time, they were upset that I hadn't told them. And I think it does make sense to let the family know and then back away and let them deal with it and take yourself out of the situation. The leaving change happened slowly. I learned to speak in statements that he couldn't argue with, and this was really important for me. When he argued, or when we argued, it always wore me down and kept me engaged. But I expressed love and compassion for both of us upon moving out. I said to him, Barry, I love you, but I can't be with you right now. And there was nothing for him to argue with. I chose those words carefully. I did love him. When things do get uncomfortable, it's a good idea to have an observer present. I remember we were working at a private school and Barry had cornered me and things were very uncomfortable. And I managed to get around him and I just went downstairs and I sat beside somebody else. And he came down and he tried to get me to leave and I would not leave. You need to have people around when you're feeling that things are uncomfortable. And I think it's important when you do leave to have adequate support for yourself. And it's good to have adequate support for the other person. And at the private school, Barry and I each had our support person that worked with us. And I think that that was a crucial step in us being able to make this, and my being able to leave him ultimately, and for it to be as safe as it was. Well, we finally got divorced. And when we got divorced, I took my son on a camping trip that summer. And this might seem insignificant, but it was such a delight to me that when we went on that camping trip and Ian was playing in the water at the beach, and there was another little girl playing with him, that the dad and I were sitting there and talking. And there was nothing romantic about it. It was just that it was okay for me to talk to another adult human being and enjoy myself. And that was a delight. But upon leaving and divorcing, it didn't actually mean total freedom for me because we were still sharing custody of my son. My son would go back and forth between the two of us. So I still saw Barry. And that made things challenging. Now, I think at this point, we want to stop and we want to say, how dangerous do you think Barry is? If you would respond in the chat for a minute, that would be great.
Yes, especially if you responded earlier. I'm interested to see if your assessment has changed. And you have a question too. When you mentioned your siblings, are you older or younger than they are?
Oh, I'm the youngest of 4. And I was actually an accident child, so there was a little more space between me and my next older.
We have 5 and 8 out of 10. So some significant increases, right?
Yes, yes.
He's not willing to let go. Maybe a 7, another 7. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah, this is actually really an illustration of what we're talking about with this cycle of violence, you know, how it can be asserted in such a subtle way at first and escalate so quickly and so dangerously.
Okay, so I will go on at this point. And after Barry and I divorced, Barry got remarried a little bit over a year after the divorce was final. But right before the marriage and right after the marriage, he approached me and he said, Marcia, just give me the word and I'll be back. Which meant he wasn't into this marriage with both feet. And that marriage didn't last long. I think it was maybe a year and a half. And then he didn't have anybody again and he was desperate and struggling. And then he had a girlfriend for a while, but it wasn't really serious. But eventually he met Evie. And this is my story. I think I may have been able to save someone's life if I could do a do-over day, like in the movie Groundhog Day. Barry called me a couple of days before he committed the crime. He said, Marcia, don't you think it is strange that Evie keeps up with her old boyfriends? I wish I could go back to that day and say to Barry, but Barry, you're speaking to me and it has nothing to do with Ian. Isn't that much the same? All I said to him was, Barry, you need to accept her as she is or you need to walk away. I wish I would have recognized the seriousness of the situation. I did know that this was the type of situation that would push him to become unhinged. From my personal experience in the past, he was losing control. I wish I would have tried to make contact with Evie, though I didn't know her phone number. It may have saved her life. I'm so sad that Evie died, and I wish I could have had the foresight to stop it. All I can do now is share this story in an attempt to help to save someone else's life in the future. And I'll turn it back to you, Emil.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a hard situation. And it's fortunate at this point that I think we are getting more chances to talk about hard things. Many of you probably when you were younger were perhaps told, you know, that if anything bad or uncomfortable ever happened, or if you were ever worried about anyone, that you should talk to someone you trusted. But that can actually be extremely hard. As we've sort of touched on, often we share this culture of self-sufficiency and independence, where if you have a problem, you have to deal with it on your own, you know, or there's this expectation that you do. And if you do anything less, if you ask anybody for advice, it puts you in a position that's less than optimal. That's simply not true. Um, we've talked about this in this presentation as well. Humans are social animals. We need support from other people. It's not an option, it is a requirement for our health, our emotional and physical health. So I've brought this information. It's called low impact disclosure. It was developed for folks in what are termed helping professions like medicine, social work, things like that. But we know that trauma, as we said in the first slide, is incredibly common. Almost everybody in this room, almost everybody that you know has interfaced with trauma in some way, whether they suffered it or it was somebody that they love. You know, so we're all exposed, right, to trauma and secondary traumatic stress as well, the stress of carrying that emotional labor. So what we want, especially at the Women's Resource Center, you know, is to put consent back in the front of this conversation so that everybody is more comfortable, right? If you have something weighing on your mind, instead of feeling like, well, how am I going to talk to this person that I love? How am I going to talk to my parents about this incredibly difficult thing? How am I going to talk to my child about this incredibly difficult thing? Ask first, right? And ask in a way that's more ambiguous, right? Hey, I have a serious talk. Is this a good time? You know, and allow that person to say, yes, this is a great time for me, or actually, no, I'm going through something of my own, you know, and if they say that, we need to respect that. And remember too, that we have, you know, agencies and individuals who want to support you. We that's the hardest part, is having people feel comfortable, you know, understanding that we're here for you, we want to help you, you know, we and the people in your life, you know, care so deeply about others, right? But it's difficult sometimes to say it overtly. If that person says yes, you know, this is a fine time, you can be a little bit more specific, give the topic, right? You know, for example, I was just in this presentation on domestic violence or partner violence, and it made me reflect on some of the experiences I've seen people have. Can we talk about that? And the person can be like yes or no, again, because we don't know what other people are dealing with as well, right? We need to give them that grace and that space. And then you don't have to tell every single part of what's on your mind. Give the cliff notes, so to speak, right? Or I believe they were called something else previously, but I don't remember. Give the basic tenets that are bothering you at that moment. And that way you have more control, right, over how you're disclosing this information. You know, you might say something like, you know, I'm just thinking about what I saw my, for example, mother go through, you know, and it made me reflect on the ways that that has impacted my expectations and my relationships, hypothetically, right? And then just by saying that, getting some of the distressing emotions into a narrative, we've made a big step as a person, therapeutically speaking. We've broken that initial boundary of silence, which is such a difficult thing to do. And hopefully this is a useful framework that you can take to everyone you know. But if not, I hope that it brings you joy, brings you usefulness.
So, you know, I don't want to leave the story there, because the whole idea behind this is that I want you all to have ideas of what you can do that can help to keep this from happening in the future. Where can you actually make a difference? So early intervention, keeping all children feeling loved, is a big one. And any supportive adult can be that person that's giving the love to a child, but they need to be held, they need to be coddled, they need to be cared about, they need to be listened to, they need to feel loved in all ways. Another one is nurture people's chosen individual identities. You know, people have to be loved for who they are, not that you're trying to change them into something that you think that they should be. And we have to be really careful about when bullies are affecting other kids, because this is where the other kids start feeling powerless and the bullies don't get called to task for what they're doing. And a lot of times the bullies are just acting in ways that they've learned from their parents or somebody, and they need to see that there's another way. They need to learn that there's a more loving way to react with people. So there needs to be support for everybody involved when there's a bullying situation going on. Listen and validate feelings of others. They need to learn how to trust their feelings. I would have a feeling and Barry would argue it into the floor and I wouldn't know where it went. Allow friends to talk about the hard things. If you can't listen or don't feel adequate, then help them find someone who can. If called upon to be an observer, be there. When I was in college one time, I was in this apartment and there was an apartment across the hallway, and in the middle of the night, the lady that lived over there was calling out to me to come out in the hallway, come out in the hallway. And I got up and I went out there, and here her boyfriend had been beating up on her and was trying to drag her back into the apartment. And he told me to go back in my apartment, but I didn't. I stood there. I didn't intervene. I didn't touch. I just stood there. But my presence made it uncomfortable enough for him to be there that he left. And if things get dangerous, then you need to call for help. I think one of the most important things is to continue to be present and supportive when people are struggling with a controlling partner. Remember, if they're staying, they must be getting something out of it. If you remain present and supportive to them, when and if they make the decision to change their situation, they will know that they can trust you. And ultimately, anyone facing this situation will likely need help and support to leave and find their own way in the world. For me, Codependence Anonymous helped, counseling helped. There was some women resource services that helped. Now, one other thing I want to touch on is becoming loving and compassionate towards self. I define yourself and don't let others do it for you. This was something I needed to learn. I knew I wanted to make an important decision at one point. My mother told me, no, I was going to do this. End of story. I remember a couple of years after Barry and I got divorced, and I was trying to find my way, and I really didn't want to be a teacher. And I decided I wanted to start my own business. And my sister said something to me that was very difficult. She said, Marcia, that is totally irresponsible for you as a single mom to start your own business. And she and I didn't talk for months because she couldn't talk to me. And here I was doing what I needed to do for me and not just doing what I had to do to make a buck, you know? To love yourself, you need to do the things that nurture you. For me, it was yoga, it was making good food, it was walking, it was playing with a dog, it was gardening. You have to figure that out for yourself, but you have to do the things that nurture you. And insist on being heard when it's important to you. I didn't have enough practice of that as a young child to do it, and couldn't seem to find the way to do it when I needed to say it to my mother. And if you can't do these things, if you can't nurture yourself because you're with a controlling partner, you might want to seriously think about finding a safe way to exit the relationship. But it has to be a safe exit strategy. You have to have support. Lastly, we need to be forgiving of ourselves and others. I had to learn to forgive Barry. I had to forgive family for things that they struggled with. And I had to forgive myself in many ways. I had to forgive myself for it taking 15 years to leave him. But I had to grow enough to know that I deserved better. I have to forgive myself for not being there for my son as an advocate as much as I wanted to, because I still didn't have my voice. He needed me to stand up for him with a teacher, and I tried, but I wasn't speaking with a strong enough voice. I was not assertive enough. And I need to forgive myself for not having the insight that I really should have contacted Evie. And I am doing what I'm doing now in honor of Evie, who was a very wonderful lady and had many close, tight relationships with young kids. She worked with young kids in a school. And that's what I have to offer.
I think that's just awesome. And we do have a slide for questions too, but I want to build on that just a little bit. Essentially, to reaffirm everything that Marcia just said, becoming informed and educated. When folks are really in crisis, they're unlikely to call the Women's Resource Center or a counseling department or a crisis resource first. Most likely, they're going to reach out to you. The people who are closest to you trust you because they're your family or they're your friends or they otherwise have built relationships with you that they maybe don't have with us yet or at all. And that's perfectly appropriate as long as we're compassionate, we're kind, reassure people that you believe them when they disclose these things. It's highly unlikely for people to tell falsehoods about abuse. It's, I'm not going to say it never happens, but it's extraordinarily rare. And if somebody is doing that, most often they already have something else going on in their life that is deeply troubling. Um, if you're concerned about somebody you know, be able to point to concrete examples, not just like, I don't like that person. You know, you may not, right? But when you're approaching somebody like, I'm really concerned about how your partner calls you every 30 minutes, when we're out together. Like, is this normal for you? Like, that's a compassionate way to address a problem that you might be concerned about while not blaming the person. Well, why are you always picking up his calls? We don't want to use language like "I told you so" or like "Oh, you're doing that again." It makes people feel dismissed and belittled, and we don't want to help somebody isolate their partner. Respect the decisions that people make. This is another place you should forgive people for the decisions that they make. Whenever somebody's suffering violence, they've had their autonomy compromised in some way that's very, very personal and very intense, and we don't want to contribute to that trauma. We want to allow people to make their own decisions and feel comfortable doing so and safe in their lives. It's very important that we do that. When you walk out of this room too, you can always hold other people in your lives responsible. Sometimes it might feel like, oh, am I going to be the person who changes this conversation? And sometimes that's who you need to be, right? Be the person who confronts that relative who maybe isn't as compassionate as you wish that they were. Remember that everybody is affected by violence. Again, we often think about it from one particular lens, but there are quite many, male survivors of violence. There are many, many survivors of violence who are kids. There are many, many survivors of violence in every stripe of people, no matter who they are. Um, if you love this, consider, volunteering or like you're doing right now, coming to these events and listening to the stories and cultivating empathy and community with other folks. We think that's just wonderful. And super briefly, if you're not familiar with us at all, um, we are free, we are confidential. We do serve the whole New River Valley. You can always call our hotline if you are supporting somebody through violence. That's hard. It can take a lot out of folks, even if you're doing it out of love. And our hotline's also there for you, not just the person first impacted by this violence. Maybe you're reflecting on experiences that you had when you were younger, again, things you've witnessed. Any of that is something we would love to talk to you about. You'll always get somebody who's trained or is staff there. We provide shelter in a variety of ways. We provide counseling in a variety of ways. Um, really, to put it simply, we try to coordinate whatever somebody needs in a given situation. Our advocacy component is something that I do, going in person to places like hospitals when people are getting injuries documented or evidence recovered, to be there for somebody who may otherwise be there alone. And that's the case even today. And we wish that was not so, but it is so. Especially during COVID, could often be a very isolating experience. And they take a while, a lot of the time, as much as any other office does. So we like to try and be there to help. Education and outreach. The lethality assessment program is something I wanted to touch on just because of the nature of what this story is. Very, very recently, there have been more screening programs like the lethality assessment program and like the Mosaic system that attempt to find people who are at high risk of intimate partner homicide or otherwise high risk of violence and identify those folks before it happens so that we can do our best to make them aware of resources in their community. That's a hard thing to do, looking into the future and predicting this person is at high risk of danger right now. But the Maryland Project, the Maryland Anti-Violence Project, does a very, very good job of doing that, and sometimes getting resources into the hands of folks who may otherwise never have heard of it, because it's coming from often a road officer, or in the case of the Mosaic system, an online quiz. The culture around violence is changing, and I think in many ways it's changing for the better. And finally, I just want to thank you for your time. I'm so grateful. I would be happy to answer any questions. I'm sure any of us would be. But that's all for me, unless you have anything else you would like to add.
Nope. Just opening up for questions if there are any. That'd be fine.
And I can keep an eye here in the chat as well.
Neil, Plowshare covers Southwest Virginia, but a lot of us are in Roanoke. Is there a Roanoke counterpart to Women's Resource Center?
Yes, there are actually a couple of anti-violence resources in Roanoke, some of whom I've been to trainings with, and they have done a really good job of doing that equitably. The one that jumps to mind is Ujima, which works, I believe, with Black survivors of violence, and they put on a really wonderful conference on anti-violence work in an anti-racist context as well. I know you mentioned your Frederick Douglass talk, so that may be something, a resource that you might want to have on hand for folks. There are a couple of other agencies as well. I can only think of the one in Hanover right now, which is Hanover Safe Place, but there are others that we work with. And sometimes that's what's most appropriate, you know. Sometimes somebody doesn't want to stay in the New River Valley anymore because this is where, you know, this violence took place, and they want to go live with their family over in Bluefield, and we do our best to try and coordinate that for them.
There's a women's shelter in Roanoke, I know. I'm not sure what kind of services they offer. How do you spell Ujima?
It's Ujima, and if that's not correct, it's quite close.
Thanks.
For the most part, the services in these agencies are pretty even across the board. And I will say at this point, most of them serve all survivors, even if their name is the Women's Resource Center. Like in our case, we are here for like all survivors of violence, no matter their gender or sexuality or type of relationship. But we do honor too that this is a problem that disproportionately is impacting women, you know, and that women have disproportionately in the past suffered from. So.
Okay, I saw a question here. And I'm going to bring it up again. So, did your experience with your cousins and sibling affect your relationship with them today? I would have thought the parents were the main issue in the situation, but did you feel something about the treatment towards them versus you? You know, at this point in time, we have grown beyond it. And I mean, I actually went through my presentation with my sister prior to doing it because I knew I wanted to bring up that one story because it was such a good illustration. And she gave me permission to share it. And so, but I think in general, we've grown through it. I'm sure we still have some issues. I know we still have some issues, but we're loving and caring for each other. And yeah, I think my father really wasn't the disciplinarian, and I don't mean to get him off the hook because he should have stepped in too, but mom was the one that usually did it. So, and she really didn't do as much. And my cousin and I are great friends at this point in time. Then there's one, did your son imitate any of Barry's attitudes? I don't think so. But my son did go through a lot of trauma because he was going into 9th grade when his father did this. He was between his 8th grade and 9th grade years. And his father ultimately died also. So he had a lot of trauma, and it's been hard. I did not know how to hold him in this.
Yeah, that's really difficult. I mean, especially for young people who are witnessing trauma, the the way often social sciences and helping agencies look at that sometimes is through the lens of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. And the more you have, the worse the cumulative effects of that trauma tends to be. But on the bright side, what we do know is, just as was mentioned a few slides ago, having even one relationship with a caring adult, with a loving, affirming adult, can do a lot to mitigate the harm that witnessing that trauma or experiencing that trauma can do. And sometimes we take a step back and we sort of see the experience of traumatic stress and violence as this horrible thing that nobody can do anything about. And the truth is, that's just not the case. The fact that our loving presence is there makes an enormous and scientifically measurable difference in the outcomes of young folks, especially.
Okay.
Should we do a last call for questions?
Sure.
Do we have any more before we bid you good evening and farewell? Oh, I'm familiar with a relationship that became toxic but never physically violent because of money issues. One partner's inability to handle money and eventually breaking into a spouse's accounts and taking money surreptitiously. How much is control over money, etc., involved? I'll let you touch on that one first because it looks like you have considerations.
Oh, well, Barry and I used to have to agree about spending money. And so it was very difficult because when I needed to have transportation, it wasn't important to him. Now we only had one bank account. We could both use it. So that wasn't an issue. It was more of a trust issue that I didn't want to do something without consulting when it came to spending the money that we had. So I don't know if that answers it, but that's.
For our part, we do frequently, money can be a very powerful tool of power and control, right? We often see it in cases of elder abuse, especially often the abuser is a child or partner of often the person who's being abused. Same thing in disability context, somebody's social security, somebody's if somebody is on disability, something like that. If that's their only income source, again, this is a huge tool that can be used to isolate and control, forcing somebody to justify, why and what they should eat, for example, is a profoundly demeaning and degrading process that many, many people go through. I personally have coordinated with clients who've had these experiences, sometimes of, being turned out with, no shoes on their feet, right? And no way to physically leave, right? Because they don't have a driver's license or a vehicle anymore. It's not the money in and of itself, if that makes sense. It's always the overarching patterns of the guilt tripping, the isolation, the emotional control, the devaluation of one partner's needs versus the others. And that there can be concurrent issues with, for example, gambling. It can be very multifaceted, but it should be taken seriously, because even if somebody doesn't put a hand on their partner, there can be severe, profound abuse. Okay, well, I think those are all of our questions. So thank you from me and the Women's Resource Center.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia and Emil. This is a really tough subject, and you're particularly Marcia, very brave in talking about it. We will be posting this on the Plowshare YouTube channel, this program. Again, if you'd like to learn about more of our events, put your name and email and mailing address up there. That's it. We usually give an honorarium. I'll be in touch with you about that, Marcia, who you want that to go to.
And I had to go to the Women's Resource Center.
That's fine. Emil, can you put your address in the chat and I'll send off a check?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I happen to know it. I'll type that up.
And thanks again. Next program is June 18th. It'll be on Palestine, and we are planning some other programs too. We're doing planning for a program on teens and lobbying because we don't just focus on adults. And there are other programs that are being planned, and we do lots of other events. So keep in touch with us. And thanks again, Emil and Marcia and Jim, for organizing this. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
All right. Oh, Emil, do you have the address there?
Yes, I just wanted to double check that I had it correct. It is 1217 Grove Avenue, Radford, VA. Okay, there you go. Oh, and here's the zip. I used to live right around the corner, so sometimes I second guess myself.
Hmm.
And I'm like, don't want to send it to my old apartment by mistake because it's one number off. But yeah, this was lovely. Marcia's such a great talker.
Yeah, we may
I
want
just
to do
love the
this
way-
again. We repeat some of the programs.
Yeah, the way she tells her story is super, super moving. Has a way with words.
All right. Thanks, folks.
Thank you
Thank
so much. Thank you.
Jim, sorry about the mix up with the invitation. I'll get it straight for next month, I promise.
Oh, but thank you.
Have a
No
good
problem.
night.
You too.
All right.